This morning, Sunday the 12th of June, the Qbserver published 2 articles, both talking about parental alienation. I'm going to look at one of them, but I just want to mention the first one. The first one was questions over the use of psychological experts in parental alienation cases. I generally agree with everything that they've written in that. The interesting bit is it's the same people who've written both of the articles, and they are Hannah Summers and Beatrix Campbell. And essentially they're saying that anyone who is involved in parental alienation cases needs to have the credentials to prove that they are experts who know what they're dealing with. I'm just going to quote Parental Alienation UK. It said, "We welcome any reasonable rigour that is introduced into the court process regarding experts in the proceedings involving children. It can only be a benefit of those involved, especially the children." And I agree with that totally. However, Hannah and Beatrix went on to write a second article called Parental Alienation and the Unregulated Experts Shattering Children's Lives. So they've taken the first one and they've put a bit more detail into this one. And I recommend you read both of them just to see the difference between the two. They start off with a case study about a woman called Amanda. And then it goes on to say, the Qbserver is aware of a number of cases in which mothers and sometimes fathers have lost custody of their children after being accused of parental alienation, meaning a child is manifesting unjustified hostility towards one parent as a result of psychological manipulation by the other parent. And then this one cites Richard Gardner. Now, every time I see that, the hairs on the back of my neck go up on end because I know what they're trying to say. The thing is, the statistical basis for this is all sound. The case studies, all the work that he did, is used by people, Jen Harman, Bill Burnett, Alan Blocky, Amy Baker. They've all built upon the work that Richard Gardner did. And their work is totally and utterly sound. Okay, so Richard Gardner, the syndrome, which went on to be largely rejected. No, it's not rejected, it happens. But the idea of parental alienation as a pattern of behaviour gained traction and has become complex legal territory in English and Welsh family courts. No, it's become a complex legal territory globally in courts across the world. Let's get that right. This is a global phenomenon. Just like COVID was a global pandemic, parental alienation is a global phenomenon and it needs to be addressed. Let's get back to the article. Julie Doughty has written research. She's a lecturer at Cardiff University, and she says that while such cases are rare, they clearly fall within significant harms in the statutory guidance. They're not rare. They happen all the time. I am a teacher. I see parents separating and children having to live through the trauma of their parents separating and being split between the two parents. That in itself is traumatic, but then when the child is then forced to try and pick a side, it shouldn't happen. Then we got the first of the women that are often associated with denying PA. It's the Victims Commissioner, Claire Waxman. There is no way of getting your children back unless you admit you have alienated them. Hang on a minute. I never admitted that I alienated my daughter. In fact, I didn't alienate my daughter. I was actively encouraging her to have a relationship with her dad. Her dad alienated me from my daughter. And yeah, I do have my daughter back in my life, but it was nothing to do with the courts. It was due to my persistence in wanting to have her in my life. Then they quote Jenny Beck, QC. There are arguments about whether it is even a concept. No, it is a concept. In fact, it's very real. I've experienced it. The Mums of Rock have experienced it. The parents that contact Parental Alienation UK and PA Awareness have experienced it. The grandparents that are part of the contact Bristol grandparents and the Hendon grandparents groups and grandparents groups across the country. Some of them have often experienced parental alienation as well. It's not a concept. It's not a myth. it's real. Then Adrienne Barnett is quoted, and she says, "In cases where the court instructs the alienating parent to foot the bill, they can find themselves held to ransom, either pay up or risk losing their children indefinitely." Now, hang on a minute. You go to court. You're struggling to get contact with your child. You will do whatever you need to do to try and get that child back into your life. And it takes both parents to put the best interest of the child first. That means both parents, if they've got to this awful position where the child is hostile or resisting contact with the other parent for no good reason, if you've got to that point, there needs to be therapy for all three or more, if there's more children, three people: the alienating parent, the alienated parent, and the child, so that they can try and get back to a healthy relationship. She goes on to say that there is growing anxiety between the potential conflict of interest presented where an expert could be financially incentivized to make a finding of PA in a system that allows them to recommend their own therapy or that of colleagues. Well, I would argue that, surely it would be a financial conflict of interest. You have that in business. We're putting the children first, so that would just go with good practice. Right, I'm shooting that down a bit, and quite rightly, the report says that such therapeutic interventions can cost around £10,000. The cost of the report can cost as much as £10,000, but the cost of therapeutic interventions can run into tens of thousands of pounds, in addition to the legal fees that can prove crippling to parents embroiled in drawn-out litigation. Remember, these parents have probably gone through divorce, and they're absolutely threadbare, no pennies left for such litigation, which is heartbreaking. And what's most heartbreaking of all is the fact that if it was prevented at the point of separation, if these parents were aware of the way their behaviour could impact their children, why, no, I would do whatever I could to prevent it. It's what loving parents do, isn't it? Right, Natalie Page has reported that several mothers reported that they had lost their homes and life savings during lengthy court battles that ultimately resulted in the removal of their children. Worryingly, some of these women also claimed to be victims of domestic or emotional abuse by the former partner that, on occasions, has been recognised by the court. Well, I'm just going to flip that round again and say several fathers have reported that they have lost their homes and their life savings during lengthy court battles that ultimately resulted not in the removal of their children, but all contact with their children being lost, or potentially the removal, whichever. Worryingly, some of these fathers also claim to be the victims of domestic or emotional abuse by the former partner, and that on occasion, even this has been recognised in court. What she hasn't added is that even if you try to contest it and say that your enforcement orders have been breached, there's nowhere to go. Nobody enforces it. And who loses? The children. Claire Waxman, the London's Victims Commissioner, has written to the head of the court, the president of the Family Division, Sir Andrew McFarlane, raising concerns about experts, and said that's talked about in the first article. But she goes on to argue that the current processes are insufficient to prevent recommendations from experts who misled about their credentials and are affiliated to lobby organisations and have a history of complaints against them. I think it's in everybody's interest to make sure that everyone is happy with the credentials of experts used in the court, not just Claire, but all vested parties. It goes on to say that Waxman does not deny that children are weaponised in acrimonious separations. Thank you, Claire. We've been trying to tell you that for ages, but thank you for spelling it out, because that's your job, to advocate for children who are at risk of significant harm when separations become acrimonious. And she says this behaviour is harmful. However, she said, in some extreme cases, children have disclosed very serious abuse and were told by experts and judges that they haven't been abused, but rather they've been alienated by the parent they deem to be safe. That potentially is hugely dangerous for those children who are at risk of being removed from their protective, safe parent. My only comment here is, what's the difference between alienation and abuse? Alienating behaviours is abuse. Alienating behaviours are coercive control and emotional abuse, and if for adults, it can be financial abuse as well. Then talks about a report by the Ministry of Justice in 2020, which is commonly called the Harm Report, which cites, fears of false allegations of parental alienation are clearly a barrier to victims of abuse telling the courts about their experiences. Fears of not being taken seriously. I would argue that parental alienation, if it is cited, needs experts to find out exactly what is happening. The same report notes that the Family Law Bar Association raised challenges posed by a small number of cases in which the court was satisfied that children have been emotionally abused by a parent who has made false allegations of abuse against another parent. The bit I would question here is whether that is small. Of the cases that get to court, we really need to figure out exactly what is happening, because I'm hearing it all the time that false allegations have been made. It goes on to talk about mandatory for all family judges and magistrates to complete training in domestic abuse, and that this digital updated training was launched in October last year, and new live training sessions that address Domestic Abuse Act 2021 were launched in April. Now, I have a little question here. How can you launch training and everything else to help these experts when the statutory guidance has not yet been published? It's asking the question. Charlotte Proudman. Finally, Charlotte says that parental alienation has become a go-to tactic used by alleged or found perpetrators of domestic abuse. I would argue it's the court's job to figure out what is happening if parental alienation is being cited. Of course, a perpetrator might use it, but there are so many other ways that parental alienation plays out. She goes on to say that in some cases, they call on PA experts to assess family dynamics before there is even a hearing to determine whether the allegations of abuse are legitimate. She said, once PA is found, any suggestion of domestic abuse is downplayed and it is very hard to turn a case around. I've seen a couple of cases where a mother has never seen her children again and must wait until they are 18. I would argue that if you've been alienated from your children and your children search you out when they turn 18, you are very lucky and very blessed. Most alienated parents have to wait until, for whatever reason, that child has that moment when they see that the other parent actually has been causing them more harm, and that the parent that they've been told is harmful, is out to get them, and that they are scared of that parent, actually was a safe, loving parent. And you can imagine how that feels for both the parent having been denied that child and then the child having to rebuild a relationship with the parent that they've been denied. You only need to listen to some of the children who have been victims of parental alienation to see how their heart breaks. Oh, and we shouldn't forget grandparents here. You know, grandparents quite often die without seeing their grandchildren again. And that was one of the things that was brought up in our survey last year, were grandparents saying, I'm frightened, I'm scared, I'm never going to see my grandchildren again before I die. It shouldn't happen. If they've had good, safe, loving relationships, why can't they continue to have that? Okay, back to the report. Beverly Watkins says that a large part of my caseload involves domestic violence cases, representing mothers, and the fathers will often raise parental alienation. But generally speaking, the courts are very hesitant to accept such claims. Again, it's gendered. Why is this gendered? Both parents are equally capable of alienating a child to reject a safe loving parent. It doesn't need to be gendered. Claire Waxman has called for a review of how experts are appointed. I think that's probably a good thing. But this is the bit that I think is the most concerning part of this article. It quotes the NSPCC, and it quotes in the evidence that they gave to the House of Lords Committee, published in May, stating that the credence given to claims of parental alienation resulted in claims of domestic or other abuse being dismissed or minimised. It added, the NSPCC does not believe that there is sufficient evidence to support the concept of parental alienation. Did you hear that? The NSPCC does not support the concept of parental alienation. That means the NSPCC will not accept that my daughter was subjected to years of emotional and psychological abuse from the man who was supposed to have her best interests at heart and stopped her from having a loving, meaningful relationship with me. But not just for me, but for the thousands of parents and children, actually tens of thousands of parents and children in this country, and globally it will go into millions. That's really scary. It's really scary because probably parental alienation is probably the main cause of adverse childhood experiences, and yet they say there is insufficient evidence. It's wrong. So wrong. You only need to cite researchers like Jen Harman, Bill Burnett, Alan Blocky, Amy Baker to know that there is more than sufficient evidence. However, proponents of parental alienation say it is so widespread that tens of thousands of UK parents are victims. Did you hear that? Tens of thousands. And I know that because they're contacting me on a daily basis. I sit with a cup of coffee and I have to try and encourage a mum to stay strong when she can't see her own children, and she's not a risk to them. Going on down, Hannah Jones, a chartered forensic psychologist who has been appointed by the family courts as an expert since 2014, said true alienation of a parent where that parent is entirely unproblematic is rare enough that it does not need its own concept. Okay, we've got Parental Alienation UK saying that there are tens of thousands of parents who are affected, and an expert here saying that it doesn't even need to be a concept. I can't agree with that. And as I said, my experience doesn't bear that out. In 2020, the World Health Organization dropped the term from its index of diseases, saying there is no evidence-based healthcare interventions specifically for parental alienation. Well, I would argue that Alan Blocky has done lots of research. I know that Split the Difference in Wales has done fantastic intervention. We need to be encouraging this, not dismissing it. Jones says anyone selling therapy to treat PA is doing so without any evidence base. I've just said there is evidence base. Come on, get your facts right. She said when alienation is found as a form of brainwashing, children are not trusted as messengers of their own experience, and there is a risk that the claims of abuse can be chalked up as a product of alienating behaviour. Hang on a minute. We are saying you need to talk to the children, but what we're saying is we need experts who are trained to establish whether the child is talking about what they actually mean or whether they are just repeating mantras that the alienating parent has indoctrinated into them, brainwashed into them. And that's why we need expert psychologists who know what they are doing. Claire Waxman goes on to say that there is no way of getting your children back unless you admit you have alienated them. And not wanting to do the therapy is seen as resisting. It also states here that the options for a parent who believes that they have been wrongly accused of alienation are limited and costly. Yes, definitely. I couldn't get my daughter back, and I didn't alienate her. It was my ex that alienated her from me. But yeah, gosh, we needed therapy when she finally came back into my life. We needed to be able to understand what had been going on in a safe environment. And that never happened. yes, she's back in my life and I have to be so careful about what I say even now. But I'm there. So I'm one of the lucky ones. Okay. When an expert is proposed, all parties in a case have an opportunity to comment on whether they oppose the expert and make representations to the court, says Kafkas. Okay, I know of cases where one parent recommends an HCPC expert, but the other one isn't interested and they keep on rejecting one. And then they find an expert that isn't HCPC regulated, which clearly isn't acceptable to the other parent, or an HCPC registered expert who has the belief that parental alienation is just a concept that shouldn't be taken seriously. You know, how can you have this dichotomy of two extremes? We need experts who understand how to get into the nitty-gritty, the dynamics of this awful, awful, pernicious abuse. The service, which says it goes on not to instruct experts or make recommendations to the court, added it is the responsibility of the court dealing with any case to satisfy itself that the proposed expert is suitably qualified to deal with matters that they are instructed to report to the court on, regardless of who has proposed the instruction. It all sounds very confusing. And as we saw in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard, you have two psychologists who can come up with very different conclusions. But it has to be evidence-based. You need to back it up. It's so important. It goes on to say there's very little research in the UK and very limited because of the lack of robust empirical studies. However, in the US, Jen Harmon and Alan Blocky have both got lots of really good research which can be used. And I said this is a global phenomenon. It's not just something that is limited to England and Wales. So we should be using research from around the globe. Yes, there will be slightly different cultural differences, but the conflict between the two parents trying to work out and the harm that is caused to the child, surely we can use that research. It then goes on to talk about the transparency of the family court. My ending conclusion here is just what we need is an open discussion about what parental alienation is. We need to start talking about parental alienation. We need to know how to prevent it so that when couples separate and there are children involved, that these children are not harmed, that they aren't forced to choose sides, that when they choose residency, that they understand that they'll still have contact with the other parent, and how to encourage and to foster healthy relationships with both parents after separation. And if there's abuse, that's a child protection issue that should be dealt with separately. We also need to figure out how we can cure it, the right therapies to cure the awful harm that is caused by parental alienation. As I said, it's cited that the report cost £10,000. The therapy can cost tens of thousands of pounds, but I want you to consider this. What is the cost to the economy of mental health issues and days lost to parental alienation with children and parents? I would argue that's millions, if not billions. We need to deal with this. Okay, so that is my analysis of this. And it just sums up that with parental alienation, we need to take it seriously. Just like Me Too needs to be taken seriously. If people are saying Me Too, take them seriously. If people are saying that there's parental alienation, take it seriously, because there will be children in the equation that are at risk of harm. Thank you. I'll put all the links down below. Please subscribe. I will continue to make more videos like this. Take care.